History books describe the Mongols as a disaster. Ruined cities, flowing rivers, libraries turned to ash like the collapse of a civilization. Silent streets in Nishapur, emptied cities in Merv, the fall of Baghdad, these are not lies. But this narrative is incomplete because this story only tells what is visible. The Mongols did not just destroy, they built something new in place of the world they tore down. For the first time, they connected geographies that were previously disconnected within a single system. A line stretching from China to Central Asia, from the Islamic world to Europe, a world where trade, knowledge, and people could move within the same network. And that is why the Mongols were not just a disaster, but a turning point. At the beginning of the 13th century, the Central Asian steppe was a periphery compared to the settled world. In Chinese records, it was often seen as the outside. But this periphery was not chaotic. It had a different order. In this world, politics was organized not around cities, but around movement. Nomads did not accumulate land. Land was temporary. They accumulated distance. A community's power was measured by how far it could go and how fast it could move. This was not a state, it was a movement system, and a figure emerging from this world transformed this movement into a system. Genghis Khan. Before he was a conqueror, he was an organizer. What he did in 1206 was not just uniting tribes, it was putting them into the same rhythm of movement. Loyalty was no longer tied to blood, but to the system. Scattered communities transformed into a single operational network. The Mongol system did not consist only of movement, it also had a political logic built on violence. When Genghis Khan's armies advanced, those before them had two choices: to surrender or to fight. And this choice often did not change the result, because resistance was not just a military situation, it was made into an example: the fall of Nishapur, Merv, and Baghdad in 1258. These events were not just destruction, they were a message. The cost of resistance is higher than surrendering. The Mongols created fear, and this fear broke resistance. That is why their conquests were fast. But this picture was not the same everywhere. For example, in China, especially during the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols preferred control over direct destruction. The existing bureaucracy was largely preserved. The tax system was regulated. The administrative structure continued to function. In other words, the Mongol strategy was not one-dimensional. When faced with resistance, violence was deployed. When faced with obedience, integration came into play. Therefore, this violence was not random. It was used not to produce chaos, but to establish order. It provided shock in the short term and control in the long term. When the conquest ended, something else began: order. For the first time in history, the Mongol Empire united disconnected civilization basins within a single operational network. The backbone of this network was the Yam system. Postal stations established at regular intervals, fresh horses waiting ready at each station, messengers advancing without rest. A message could travel thousands of kilometers in days. This structure did not just carry news, it circulated orders, tax records, and military information. So this system was not just a road network, it was like the nervous system of the state. The center could monitor the most distant region and intervene when necessary. Distance was no longer an obstacle, but a manageable variable. Travelers like Marco Polo could move between continents within this secure network. This mobility was the result of an established order, not individual courage. The Silk Road was no longer a trade line subject to interruption. It was not fragmented between different political borders. It operated under a single security and control system. Merchants, artisans, envoys, and scholars traveled on the same roads. That is why this period is called the Mongol Peace, Pax Mongolica. It was an era where roads were guaranteed, distance was brought under control, and the world's first large-scale connection system was established. It was an age of infrastructure. The Mongols did not force the lands they conquered into a single mold. They did not homogenize them. What they did was different, connecting different worlds. The Mongol Empire's approach to governance was not uniform, but its basic principles were quite clear. Protect the local order, but bind it to the central system. For this reason, in China, the existing bureaucratic structure largely continued. The civil service system, the recording system, and administrative traditions were maintained. In Iran, the Persian language of correspondence and settled administrative practices were kept operational. The Ilkhanate state is one of the clearest examples of this model. In most places, the Mongols did not become direct administrators, but they were the ultimate authority everywhere. Local elites remained in office, but were now tied to the Mongol system. Taxation became regular, censuses were conducted, production and trade were recorded. Thanks to this, the empire did not just expand, it became trackable, and the most critical element, distance, was brought under control. Roads were secured, communication was accelerated. The disconnect between the center and the periphery was reduced. Because in the Mongol system, power was born not from cities, but from connections. Therefore, this structure was not an empire in the classical sense, but a network management system. To understand this system, a comparison is needed. The Roman Empire was one of the strongest and most organized structures ever established. It built roads, created a legal system, and secured trade. But this order had a limit: the Mediterranean world. Rome's power was concentrated around this inner basin. Economy, politics, and culture revolved largely within the same geographical basin. Rome ruled a world, but that world was a regional system gathered around a single center. The Mongols did something different. For the first time, the Mongol Empire connected disconnected civilization basins within the same system. China's world of production, Central Asia's transition zone, the Islamic world's trade and knowledge network, and Europe's markets. These regions, which previously operated independently, united within a single security, communication, and trade system. This was not just territorial expansion, it was an integration process where different worlds could work simultaneously. Rome built a world, but that world was internal. The Mongols, however, built a connection between worlds. The Mongol Empire did not just establish a network, it defined the tools that operated it. The most concrete tool of this system was the Paiza, an identity and authorization document made of metal. It bore the authority of the ruler. A merchant or envoy carrying this document gained priority at every point of the empire. Doors opened, horses were changed, and their path was never blocked. The Paiza was not just a permit, it was the guarantee of movement. This system was completed by the Yam network. Stations established at regular intervals, horses ready at each station, officials, records, inspections. When a messenger arrived, he didn't stop. He only changed horses. The message moved forward. The state moved forward. There was military security on the roads. Robbery was not just a crime. It was considered a violation against the state. Its punishment was severe. For the first time, merchants could use a path of thousands of kilometers by calculation. But the system did not only transport people, knowledge was also moving. Paper production techniques, gunpowder knowledge, medical texts, information belonging to different worlds entered circulation within the same network. This was not a random circulation. It was a flow protected and made possible by the state. Every system has a limit. The Mongol Empire established the largest land empire history has ever seen. But this size was also its greatest vulnerability. In the beginning, there was a single center, a single will, and a single rhythm of movement. But over time, this rhythm broke. As the empire grew, the distance between the center and the periphery became not just physical, but political. Dynasty members gained power in different regions. Each began to establish their own center. Different interests emerged within the same family. This was not a destruction coming from the outside. It was a dissolution beginning from within. The unity established by Genghis Khan could not be maintained the same way after his death. The empire split into parts: the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanids, and the Yuan administration. There was no longer a single empire. But what was remarkable was this. This fragmentation did not destroy the system. The roads were still working. Trade continued. Connections were not broken. In other words, the Mongol world collapsed, but the order it established continued to live. The Mongol Empire disappeared, but the order it established did not. Because the Mongols did not just rule lands, they established a way of functioning. First, the most obvious continuation was the Ilkhanate state. The same administrative logic continued. More to the east, this legacy gained a new identity. Babur Shah was a ruler who embraced the tradition. And in Anatolia, the Ottoman Empire was not a direct Mongol state, but it was shaped within the post-Mongol world. Similarly, a transformation took place in the north. The Golden Horde state was decisive over Eastern Europe and Russian lands for a long time. In this process, Russian principalities, especially the Muscovy Principality, learned practices such as tax collection, census taking, and establishing central authority within this order. Over time, this structure strengthened and established its own central state. So, the Mongol influence here was not a direct continuation, but a ground for transformation. But the legacy did not live only in states. Something deeper changed. The perception of the world changed. China was no longer disconnected from Europe. The Islamic world was no longer a center on its own. Different civilizations had become parts of the same network. This idea, the idea of a connected world, was the most lasting legacy of the Mongol era.